2 of my driving home video on Monday, April 12th, 2021. And I left off drawing a picture of how even though the internet really took off and the web accelerated its impact, it was still corporately undermined. The LAMP platform, which could have continued to evolve and grow into something spectacular, basically piddled and died out. It broke up into its various parts and ran in their different directions, each of which were corporately targeted and bought, acquired, wrapped in some way. And we're actually quite fortunate that things are still as free and open as they continue to be today. But to say that it's troublesome that Microsoft, of all companies, bought GitHub is a bit of an understatement. As long as the licenses don't change. See, the free and open source world did itself a wonderful favor in getting dotting all their I's and crossing all their T's, getting the legality of these free and open source licenses down, because it can make corporations bend to the will of the original intent and spirit of the license. That's why Linksys, the infamous WRT Linksys Blue Router, again the birth of the home Wi-Fi network, iconic device, had to share back its operating code to the free and open source world because it actually used stuff that used the GNU license. I believe GNU 2, the one that forced you to contribute back any thing that you made and profited off of. You couldn't keep the proprietary bits, which is what led to GNU 3 and the TiVo, evolution of these licenses, so that companies can still keep secret closed boxes even when there's free and open source stuff inside, which is what has kept Linus from moving, I believe, the Linux kernel from GNU License 2 to GNU License 3, no matter the pressure he receives from the community. And I guess that's sort of one of the reasons that it's still good to have, benevolent dictators for life. What Linus Torvalds is to Linux is no longer what Guido van Rossum is to Python. While everyone's really going to take Guido's advice on the direction Python should go and the yay or nay on certain features, everyone's going to be conceding to him for the foreseeable future, for as long as he's alive and he cares. Such is not necessarily the case with things that get brought into the corporate fold, or that lose their original founder and cede control to boards, which is what Python did. And they can have charters and missions and stuff like that, and we'll have to adhere as close to it as reasonable. But slippery slope has begun. These things can be corrupt over time by their stewards, by the people who get elected in with different agendas than what was thought at first, by sufficient money being offered by the corporate sponsors. And things can be bent and twisted over time to service the shareholders of public companies. That's what it really amounts to. So Microsoft wants everything that I've identified as the stuff you can commit your time, your life, your muscle memory to, with certain portions of it, having a high resistance to change over time while still being directly useful. And, standards not changing with fads and fashion. That's really dangerous. It's what I object to about the JavaScript framework world. As much as things are settling on React, it's like, oh yeah, React what? There's like 6 different flavors so far of React that you've needed to get down to stay modern and current. And the latest one is going to React hooks, and so it goes. I mean, Python has its share, but the point is, what is the granularity at which you stop calling it the programming language and start calling it the framework? And I would claim that Python reaches much higher up into that process, so that the frameworks are sometimes hardly even frameworks. You hear the term micro framework thrown around. And the wrapper decorator methodology that's used with things like Flask, it's like, is that a framework in the way that React is a framework for JavaScript in Node.js world? Or is it a framework in the sense that the behavior of the default language has just been modified and twisted a little bit to do this awesome new world of stuff that, was not envisioned for Python in its early days, because it just wasn't written when the world was that way. But since the world has changed, Python has been able to be pushed and twisted to change with it. Going to concurrency is probably one of the more recent examples, but it's not the only example. Python is rich with API adjustments in space that hasn't been reserved for anything else yet, so they could get away with it. List comprehensions come to mind. The context manager for with open as file handle comes to mind, along hand in hand with the generator pattern, so that you can handle massively large amounts of data in Python with a relatively modest system and processing power. It might take a while to churn through it, but it can get through a petabyte file if it needed to, because of generators. What else? I mean, the list goes on. At what point am I making Linux, Python, Vim, and Git? It seems to be the point I keep coming back to. And how even though I started talking about it 10 years ago, and the world has recognized this reality, and the corporations have been adjusting and twisting, and I myself have been a non-player in the whole thing, except keeping myself from going obsolete. My way of being a player in this landscape has increasingly clarified into techniques to not become obsolete in a fad-driven IT landscape, due to a combination of intelligent choice of tools and mindset. Mindset definitely plays a role. So you choose your tools intelligently and hope that those who have the same insights as you, who come to buy and corrupt and twist the tools, will not corrupt and twist them beyond my original intended usability, thanks in part due to the free and open source licenses that keep certain bits of it from being bent and twisted beyond its purpose. Such is the case with Git, that is underneath GitHub. Such is the case with Node.js, which is underneath NPM. Microsoft acquired the repository system of Node.js. Microsoft bought it, even though Node.js was incubated from out of the very Google-centric world of the V8 JavaScript engine that was extracted from the Chromium free and open source version of Chrome project that was given to the community by Google. Microsoft embraces that code and does a whole bunch of interesting things with it. It uses it as the basis for VS Code, because Linux, Python, Vim, and Git, Microsoft, having looked at the text editor portion of it, or IDE if you prefer, and saying, how can we own that piece of it? Well, we already do. It's called VS Code. And they're like, no one uses VS Code. It's like Xcode. It's like overburdened and if you want to take this little bit of the C compiler in the Windows world, you got to take the whole Xcode with it. They can only get it on your machine through trickery and through the most, drinking of the Microsoft Kool-Aid people, of whom there are fewer and fewer all the time, hence embrace and displace, or if you're more optimistic, embrace and become. So Microsoft is embracing and becoming Linux, Python, Vim, and Git, but couldn't do Vim, so they did VS Code because we already have a IDE. It's called Visual Studio Code. Well, we can make a lightweight version of it and call it VS Code. Yeah, well, what makes it lightweight? It's still this very proprietary thing. How can we make it feel free and open source? Well, we can base it on all web technologies. How do you do that? Make it multi-platform? Well, you just do what all these things do, like Atom and Slack and stuff. They just use the portion of the Chromium base that has already been extracted for generic application use, the way Qt and countless other things can do, and Amiga Vision did before it. And you just take out that piece that lets you build up web apps. Bippity boppity boo, there you have VS Code now. Oh, well, if we throw enough people at it and do good enough product management, we can walk into this void that's left because Vim never went commercial and no one's going to go through the learning curve anyway, and working in a shell is terrible, and the graphical version of Vim doesn't look too hopeful. So Vim dead end. What are we going to do? Well, there's Notepad++, and there's Sublime, and there's TextMate on the Mac. There were these things that had traditions and have loyal followers. Well, why can't we just do that on the Electron-based version that we just spun out? Well, we can. We just got to throw enough resources at it. Okay, let's keep throwing resources at it until, anyone doing anything in Git as their version control system, their source revision control system, whatever you want to call it, the role that C content version control, CVCS, SV. There's these things that were out before. Subversion is one of them that did this in an old way, and then there was a proprietary package, and Linux used that proprietary package for a while because they were letting them do it for free, and then they changed that on them. Changing licensing, watch out for people changing licensing on you. It's the big trick of slippery slope. If you don't think you're being embraced and displaced by Microsoft and this whole free and open source gig, you are deeply wrong, because you are going to be reliant on GitHub. Then you're going to be reliant on Git Spaces. You'll see it coming. You'll be your first dose of VS Code free if you hadn't fallen into the VS Code trap in any of the, half dozen ways already lurking out there. Then using the GitHub code space feature will have you doing it. And then your expectations will be set, and IntelliSense will be there, and there's a whole bunch of things running interference, keeping you from discovering Jupyter Notebooks and Jupyter Labs. VS Code using the Jupyter Notebook engine, the Jupyter engine, the IPython engine, for doing this same stuff natively in VS Code. The amount of running interference that Microsoft is doing to keep you from having the same revelations I had 10 years ago and running with it full force, having no Microsoft product involved, is, not going to happen, because they've been thinking about it as long as I have. And, who am I talking? Just some person here with not even 10,000 followers on YouTube, laying it out, piece by piece, while, more or less talking about it for 10 years, and Microsoft does their thing, and, people will wake up to it, and it's not necessarily evil. It's just in service of the stakeholders and the shareholders of Microsoft, publicly held company. So it's in service of the shareholders of Microsoft, but of course, most primarily of all, the people who win big off of Microsoft stock, the people who who have big stakes in it. So if you're looking for some Kabbalistic, 1% thing here, I mean, only in so much as the free market economy and the Pareto curve of wealth distribution dictates that it will be that way. Of course it's that way, people. The question is whether you should care or not. Everybody's quality of life is going up. Well, at least it was. It was until George Bush Jr. ignored his intelligence and let 9/11 happen. Or worse than that, since, people miscounted hanging chads in Florida and he got in office and we lost our first science president, Al Gore. That's when things really started going wrong. And then, of course, they started going wrong again when, Trump didn't rally the country in support of, quarantine and vaccination and, real, getting ahead of this thing. And, in the same way, the real mistake was with the hanging chads in Florida. The real mistake was in, Trump winning. Although I fear to think how divisive and how much worse it could have been under Hillary. Greed and corruption is greed and corruption. And, so to be a person like me, you gotta learn to live and enjoy the water rising, the rising tide lifting all boats. You're one of those all boats. You're one of those smaller players, and no matter how big and highfalutin your ideas may be, if you didn't make yourself a slave to one of those big ideas early on and stick with it and nurture it and develop it and become in many ways a static person, although not bad, an artist performing, then you can always reap great rewards. There's always rewards there to be reaped. The monetary or fiscal or whatever the symbolic, representation of having made it, success is there. It's always there and can be gotten through tricks all the time. That's not what it's about. It's about feeding your soul. It's about feeling good about yourself. Success is feeling good about what you do, because you are what you do, not necessarily in a job sense, but your behavior. You've got this essential vibe, this inner portion of you that was made in great portion by, your parents, the way their chromosomes combined into you. That's your essential vibe and your essence. And then there's the software that came from that moment of conception, all the prenatal stuff that counts, sounds that got in through the womb, and then you're born, and oh my God, transitions. All of life is transitions. You learn to hold your head up first, then you learn to crawl, and then you learn to walk, and then you learn to talk, and then you learn to ride a bicycle, and then you learn to write and read, and then it gets increasingly, optional, less done, statistically less frequent of the more driven vibes. So your vibe has to decide how driven it is. My daughter is now watching My Hero Academia. My Hero Academia. I think I have it right. MHA, I'll call it, because it's a tongue twister of a name. And it's fascinating watching the motivations of these different characters. Bakugo, Deku, there's all these characters. Okachu, I'm just getting their names down. I gotta get better at these Japanese names. They did not Americanify the names, which is great. And Addie's growing up with these characters, and these characters' attitudes towards being heroes. Because supervillains were also created as a result of this unexplained event, they take advantage of their superhuman abilities to commit crimes. So in symmetry, heroes had to rise into existence to keep the population safe. And 80% of the population is born with some kind of significant measurable quirk. These are superpowers. And so it's the majority, but the majority of them don't use it. They're not allowed to. It's like against the law unless you decide to become a hero, in which case they nurture they help you, they fund you to nurture your powers and to become a hero. And you're like the police. There's also the police at the same time. But being one of these Leica heroes is a big deal. And it's like the sports, people follow them, they're fans, sports, music, all wrapped up together. And science, I might add, because there is super science in this midst. And animals becoming sentient in the human sense. And in this big soupy mix of almost like our world, but this one difference, you get to see the mindset of how these different people are driven, and it gives you this wonderful insight. It's one of the reasons why the Green Lantern has always and continues to be one of my most favorite superheroes, because it is just human will manifest. We do nothing but make the energy that's all around us anyway, that you happen to manipulate through this ring, able to take solid form based on your imagination. The rest is in your hands, right? Wow. Sheer human will and determination is, what makes the Green Lantern so powerful. And that has always appealed to me. And I see that driven human will thing so much in play here in this My Hero Academia that I'm thrilled that Addie at her 10-year-old time, the age of Alice and Dorothy and Harry Potter, I guess is a better way to put it these days, the age of growing, the age of becoming who you are. My daughter gets to expose herself to some of the best media I have ever seen along these lines. Quality stuff, and I'm watching it right along with her, and am delighting in the experience. So I guess I wrap it up there, and put a wrap or a bow tie on it. So all the things about Linux, Python, Vim, and Git that I identified as important, Microsoft also did too, and has been trying to get out in front of everybody. And the portions that I offer that are different have a particularly unique and I think resonating flavor to them that keeps my nearly 10,000 followers on YouTube at that point, even though the ones who are there for quick fixes keep dropping off. I can see gain, lose, gain. Let's see, it would be about 30 steps forward, 29 steps back. 30 steps forward, 29 steps back in terms of my follower acquisition, which I think is fun. It's great because YouTube for me, not for you so much, to think things through out loud. This improves the quality of my work. You're my sounding wall. And my final go-ahead to do this was that I somehow managed to be in this special class of people who can just keep posting and posting video endlessly with seemingly no limitation at Google's expense. I'm like, hey, why not? They stopped doing unlimited photo uploads. They're still doing unlimited YouTube uploads in some places where they can make money off of me running those ads. So yeah, so what? I get my word out. It's like publishing. Paying for self-publishing. That's how you pay for self-publishing. Google gets to run ads over me. Hello, whatever ads you have to watch. Leave comments telling me what ads run. I'll tell you whether I endorse it or not. Make this a little more interactive. So anyway, I'll wrap up there. I think I need to get into the sequel. Commit. Planning and committing. Planning and committing. I have resisted planning and committing and lived in the NoSQL world for many, many years. now that I have to do rows and columns, I have to live in the planning and committing world, and I'm not thrilled about doing that. So I'm going to put as much of a little temporary flavor edge on it as I can as I go. How easy it is to make new SQLite tables from scratch, delete them, remake them again. The only reason to not treat them as temporary tables is to keep the data that rolls past that 16-month rolling window of Google Search Console for my own personal sites right now, which is what my videos are about. And to do that, I will adjust my projects I take on, maybe my style a little bit, and commit to a thing or two and do a little planning coming up. And thanks for joining me. Hope to see you again soon. Don't forget to subscribe.